Hold on, wait a second. Is that cutting threads in wood? That's right, we're cutting threads in wood. Want to learn more? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the wood shop. I just want to share with you some of the stuff we've been working on recently. Been prototyping some products that'll be coming up soon. But one of my favorite tools in the shop is set up on the bench right now. So I wanted to feature that today and just kind of show you this tool and what it does. And it's very simply, it does one thing. The tool does one thing. It threads wood. And threading wood has been around for a long time. It's not a new concept. I'm going to share with you today the setup that I use to do it. And really, even though this thing, this tool only does one thing, threading wood, I find it so inspiring and creative. There are so many different things that you can incorporate these wood threads in. So hopefully today, just chatting through the process of threading wood will give you some inspiration to maybe incorporate this into some of your creations. So we're here at the bench so I can show you this setup and how we create those threads. But here's really the inspiration behind that. So I'm working on a milk stool. This is a prototype. And I'm working through the first batch now, which is why the router's set up to thread. So the threads will give us the chance to disassemble it, pack it nice and safe for shipping. But once you get it, you'll be able to just screw in the legs and you're going to have a nice, strong, solid wood stool. So make sure you subscribe to the channel. You'll see more information in the coming months as we've got those products kind of ready to go and market. But this is really the first time I'm incorporating the threads into a product that we're selling. Okay, so let's get into this kit and show you how these threads work. So I'm using the Beall company wood threader, and I bought this kit several years ago. It has 6 different sizes, so I can create threads at a 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4, 1 inch, 1.25 inches, and 1.5 inches. What I like about the Beall setup is you're using the router as your cutter head. There are other ways using a thread box. I'll put some information in the description, some links to thread boxes. You can find those on Amazon. So basically the way this works is the router is attached to this plate. You basically have a steel plate here attached to a board, and then there is a kind of a die. They look like this. They come in different sizes. On the back side of the die, it's probably impossible to see here in the camera, but you have the threads on the inside of the die. You have a hole here in the top where the router bit goes through. You set the depth on the router, and then basically you're just going to turn the router on, and you feed the round stock straight through, and that creates the threads. It's a very simple system, and there's some tweaks and things to it, but that's generally how it works. Of course, threading a dowel is only one part of the process. You also have to have a corresponding nut or something that you can run those threads into to really get that action to work like you want it to. So in the kit, not only do you have the dies to attach to the router and create the threads on a dowel, but you also have these taps that cut the corresponding threads into a nut or straight into a workpiece. And so that's where you can really get creative, because it gives you the opportunity to thread really any hole in a project, much like the stool. Will be threading, creating those threads right into the stool top. One of the things that I like about the taps that come with this kit is you've got this guide bearing also on the tap. So you have the cutter head that really cuts the threads, but you also have this guide bearing that allows you to keep the tap aligned in the hole, so you're cutting those threads nice and smooth and straight. And I've really never had a problem cutting those threads. As you can see, it's a pretty simple setup. And before we take a look at it in action, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see how I've been using these threads in the shop for different jigs and fixtures. And also I'd be curious as to what you might use wooden threads for.
Being a wood turner, one of the obvious attractions of the system is being able to create your own dowels. So in this case, I've intentionally made a blank out of poplar, but a lot of times I just use scrap that I've got in the shop, and it's a very simple process. You don't have to have a lathe to be able to create the dowels. You can buy dowels, and there are many other ways you can create dowels, but that's part of the fun of this setup, is being able to make your own dowels. And for all the wood turners in the audience, this is a great project to work on your skills with the skew chisel. The one little trick with making your own dowels is to undersize them just slightly. So here I'm making a 1-inch thread. So I'm going to be just a couple thousandths of an inch below 1 inch, and it just makes the whole process go a lot smoother. So let's take a closer look at setting up the jig so we can get ready to cut some threads. So the first step before we clamped the jig into the vise here on the workbench was to attach the die on the bottom side of the steel plate. It's just held in place with a couple screws. And then the next thing we're going to do is put the guide bushing in the center. It kind of just drops into a hole that aligns with the die down below the steel plate, and that's going to align the router so that it's not too far to the left or to the right or to the front or back. So that gives us a perfect centered alignment. In the router, we're going to put in the kit there is a carbide tipped, basically just a V cutter. It's a 1/4-inch cutter, and we just put it into the router, and then when we mount the router, that bit drops right down through that alignment bushing. With that alignment bushing in place, then all we have to do with that bit perfectly centered now is to clamp down the router onto the jig. Clamping the router down to the steel plate's a really simple process. There are a couple metal brackets that basically just get kind of fastened down. They act as a clamp. And we just tighten up the wing nuts there, and that holds the router right where it needs to be. Now I like to use, you can see here I'm using a fixed full-size kind of fixed base router, and this is my preference. I've tried it before with a small palm router. I've tried it with a plunge router, but I find the fixed base router is just the easiest to deal with. Once we have the router all tightened down, we're going to take the motor off the base. So now that we've got that alignment, everything's tight, we're just going to pull the motor out. We're going to remove that guide bushing because we don't want that in there while it's cutting. And then all we have left to do is reinsert the router and then adjust the depth of the router bit. The trickiest part of this process is adjusting the router bit. In the instructions, it kind of gives you some ideas and guidelines, but frankly, the easiest way to do it is kind of by eye. You just want the tip of the bit to be visible down just below the threads. I think in the instructions, it's about a 32nd of an inch. It's and basically if you can kind of see it and feel it a little bit, that's in about the right spot. Another thing that I do oftentimes to help kind of speed up that alignment with that depth, if I've got an extra piece or just a segment of the thread I'm wanting to cut, in this instance we're cutting 1-inch threads, I would go ahead and insert that into the jig and then lower the bit so I can just kind of feel that, feel the cutter head kind of drag just a little bit, raise it up just a hair, and then that helps. That's a quick way or a shortcut in setting the depth on the router. With everything set up and aligned, all that's left to do now is kind of kick everything on and start cutting threads. This process with the router does make a big mess. You can see back there in the background I do have the vacuum running, trying to catch some of the wood shavings and chips coming off the router, but it does kind of make a big mess. I'm also wearing a full face respirator, my safety glasses, just trying to stay safe because this process is pretty messy. So all we're really doing here as we feed the dowel into the jig, the cutter kind of picks up the very end of the dowel and you just start rotating it and you'll pick up the threads on the back side of that die. And and basically from there you're just gonna, it's like a screw, you just kind of work it in. On the front side here we've got a normal dowel with nothing on it. On the back side we'll have a threaded screw. We are featuring the Beall wood threader here in this video, but this is not sponsored in any way by Beall Tool Company. In fact, Beall is now distributed through Lee Valley Tools. I'll leave links in the description below so you can kind of check that out, but I believe Lee Valley came to an arrangement or bought out Beall Tool Company as the original founders of Beall when they were looking to retire and kind of wind down their business, but a lot of their really specialty tools are still distributed through Lee Valley, so you can still get all of these great things that they created. You can also cut threads in wood using a thread box, which is just a different process. It kind of manually cuts the threads, very similar to this. I'll leave links in the description below so you can kind of check out that process as well. One of the reasons why, when I was researching all this stuff, one of the things that attracted me to the Beall system, one is really as soon as you're done with this process here, running, creating the threads with the router, you can use this immediately. For the best results with a thread box, you're normally soaking the dowel in mineral oil or some kind of oil for a period of time, which also means you have to let it dry out after you're done cutting the threads. So for me, I just like this process. I can create dowels on the lathe really quickly. I can come back to this, thread it, and kind of use it immediately. So that was one of the things that attracted me to this system. Of course, cutting the threads on a dowel is just half the equation. So here I'm going to use the taps that come in the set to create the female threads. And that first step, all I was doing is kind of lubricating the tap with some mineral oil. And on this hole, since it does not go all the way through the workpiece, I'm not using the guide bearing. That does make it a lot easier, and this hole is actually at an angle. So this one's a little more difficult, but cutting the threads here with the tap works pretty simply and easily. Here we're using the tap to cut female threads into a different project part. And the real key with cutting these female threads is to not tap into the end grain. So directly into end grain, the fibers won't hold the threads. So you want to go into the side grain or the face of a board, and you'll have no problem. The other thing when cutting the female threads, it's also better to chamfer the edge of the hole, so you can do that. A lot of times I'll use a router with just a real slight chamfer bit. I've even used just sandpaper just to kind of chamfer the edge of the corner before I use the taps.